Welcome, everybody. It is so good to see you this morning. I am Jessie Whittish with Kentucky Youth Advocates, and we're really excited to have four panelists who are going to bring really different perspectives around K-12 education this morning. But we're also so excited to have so many advocates from across the state on today's forum. Based on the RSVP list, I know that this is the first time many of you have joined us for one of these advocate virtual forums. So thank you for joining us for the first time, or maybe this is like your 7th or 8th time. I don't even know how long we've been doing these. But if you don't already know, we're doing these every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Standard Time with different topics each week. So we hope you continue to come back after this one. We ask that you stay muted on your, keep your microphone muted, but we are taking questions and comments via the chat feature, and we encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat feature. The panelists may address those either in the chat itself or in their remarks. And if they don't, please know that we're going to have continuing conversations around education and what that's going to look like in the coming months. So those questions will inform some of the content in upcoming forums, and it also, those questions and comments are also communicated to decision makers and to other advocates as we, again, look to reopening and kind of what that's going to look like. So we really want to hear from you all. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Terry Brooks, and he's going to get us started today.
Hey, good morning, Jessie. As Jessie said, we have a little bit of a bifurcated audience today. Several of y'all are in contention to get perfect attendance pins because you've been at each of these. And then we're delighted that so many new folks are on. KYA, as Jessie mentioned, every Wednesday is doing a forum to talk about kids and COVID. We are in the middle of kids, COVID, and K-12. Last week, we had Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman, who also serves as Secretary of the Cabinet for Workforce Development and Education on. We are hoping to follow today's discussion with a conversation with Commissioner Kevin Brown and Chair of the State School Board, Lou Young, to talk about it from a Frankfurt perspective. Additionally, I would encourage you to stay tuned in or to check out our website. We have a number of other features coming up. For instance, we are going to do one of the forums around the disproportionate impact of COVID on kids of color. We're going to do one about the disproportionate impact of COVID on kids with special needs. We also have one coming up that I think will be extremely interesting, featuring the head of the AFL-CIO, the head of Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and a really thoughtful early childhood voice from Eastern Kentucky around the whole idea of what does it mean for parents to safely return to work at the same time making sure their kids are squared away. So that's sort of a look ahead for upcoming topics. You can come to our website and see exactly what is going on each Wednesday. So I'm delighted to have our four guests today. I believe that Ben Gies, who along with Harper is moderating, has written this eloquent introduction to each of them. So I don't want to Bigfoot his intro. What I will tell you is that what I love about our guests today is they match theoretical understanding with the pragmatics of schools. They all bring extraordinarily keen intellect to the table, but maybe more importantly, they also all bring big hearts. So pragmatics in theory, intellect, as well as big hearts. That's a terrific combination. So Dean Dinkins, Brent, Penny, Dr. Mooneyhan, thanks so much for being here today. And Ben, I'll kick it to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brooks. I sincerely appreciate that. And I'll try my best to be as eloquent as you think that I am.
Little pressure there.
Absolutely not. Well, first, I think we would be remiss in starting this topic of discussion today without first throwing out a big thank you, a big shout out, a big commendation for all of our teachers, school administrators, and school personnel that are on the line today, as well as the advocacy community that have been wrapped around them since the start of this crisis in late February and early March. I want to take a moment to do that because it's important. What all of you teachers do in the schools are incredibly important. It's important for that individual in the desk. It's important for your community, and it's important to this country as a whole. And I can't think of too many professions or organizations that would be told in a matter of 24 to 48 hours, here, reinvent everything that you've done for the last 20 to 30 years. Do it in 2 days and do it well, because the future of your community depends on it. That's huge pressure. And I don't speak out of turn there. I was once an 8th grade U.S. history teacher in Oldham County, Kentucky, and serving on the Jefferson County Board of Education. And so please know the amount of respect that we at KYA and across the entire Commonwealth of Kentucky that we hold for those of you in education. Thank you, thank you, thank you for what you've done, what you're doing, and what you're getting ready to do. Now that we've talked about the past, we feel that today is an appropriate moment to pivot to the future. We know that you guys whipped into shape NTI. You did the best that you could for your students. But now that we've entered into the summer vacation months, we have a real opportunity here to impact the future of what education in Kentucky will look like during the COVID crisis, but also what education in Kentucky will look like after the crisis. It's no surprise to many, especially some of our more veteran voices on the call today, that Kentucky was once #1 in the nation for education innovation. I think that with this crisis, we can get there again. And with that, I'm so excited to announce our distinguished guest on the call today. First, and guest panelist, if you would just kind of raise your hand when I introduce you, I think that would help. First up, we have Mr. Brent McKim, who is the president of the Jefferson County Teachers Association in Louisville, Kentucky. Mr. McKim brings us a solid teacher voice, but he also has an outsized influence in the administration in Frankfort, and will be able to help us in that regard as well. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Leon Mooneyhan of the Ohio Valley Educational Cooperative. Dr. Mooneyhan is not only the executive director and CEO of OVEC, but also brings with us the perspective of school administrators, school boards, and several districts throughout the Ohio Valley region of Kentucky. So thank you, Dr. Mooneyhan, for being here today. Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Penny Christian, who is the 16th District PTA, Parent-Teacher Association President from Lexington, Kentucky. And last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce from my alma mater, Dr. Elizabeth Dinkins, who is the Dean of the Fraser School of Education at Bellarmine University. Dr. Dinkins is not only the Dean of the College of Education, an academic who's known for her equity lens in ensuring that students can read and read well, but she also comes from that teacher background as well, having served at Thomas Jefferson Middle School in Jefferson County. So thank you all for being here with us today. To get started with our first topic of conversation, it's the topic that is on everyone's mind, and that's this. What's going to happen in the next school year? Will students be in their brick and mortar classroom? Will they be learning virtually? Will NTI stick around, or will we come up with a better solution? And for those students that struggled throughout NTI, what are we going to do for them to ensure that this disruption doesn't snowball into something that we at KYA and others have termed the COVID-19 slide? We're all familiar with the summer slide, and we got to think that if students are back in their brick and mortar classrooms come August, which is big if, that'll be 6 months since kids have been in a classroom with a teacher. Think about being in 1st grade and being away from your classroom for 6 months. That might as well be half of your life. And so with that, I'm going to turn our first set of questions over to Dean Dinkins and Dr. Mooneyhan. So Dean Dinkins and Dr. Mooneyhan, here's our first scenario. Imagine that it's August and our students are returning to school. What does the classroom, brick and mortar or virtual, look like in terms of safety, in terms of academics, and in terms of meeting kids' social and emotional needs? How are we going to address that COVID-19 slide? What are some lessons we've learned, challenges, and opportunities? And Dr. Mooneyhan, if I can pick on you first, I'd like to hear your thoughts around safety should students return to their brick and mortar classrooms, and your thoughts on when students might be able to return.
Right. So I think safety, what I'm hearing from superintendents and others, I think we're hearing about all of these areas, but safety's first. And you know, our expectations of what our constituents think about what we do is that we do it safely. So, you know, how do you go about social distancing? How do you get kids to school? I was on the superintendent's webinar yesterday with the commissioner and with public health, Dr. Stack, and the recommendation for transporting kids is one person on a seat and staggered throughout the bus. So if you have one person in the first front seat, there's no one across from you. And, you know, superintendents are thinking, you know, how do we do that? And I know one of the superintendents, I don't know which one, in frustration said, so, you know, are we even going to be able to start school? But I think the expectation is that we do. I think there's all sorts of, I think we'll see all sorts of combinations of providing both a distance and on-site. One of the things that I personally worry about the most is just teachers being able to connect with their students in a way that is still meaningful. I mean, I know the teachers are incredibly creative, but it's still not like being there, being able to hug a kid.
Exactly.
And so, you know, I really worry about the whole social emotional aspect of it. And I know I have a board meeting right after this with our 15 superintendents, and we're going to talk a good deal. I'm going to hear what they're saying about how they're planning to open schools. You know, but that's just, you know, getting them there is just one thing. How do we socially distance? How do you? And some think, well, I can sort of figure out how to do that with high schoolers, but how do you do it with elementary students? How do you get them to understand, you know, what you're trying to do? And so, and, you know, like kids, they'll forget. So, so how do you do meaningful instruction and worry about the safety? I mean, the last thing that all of us in education want to do is, you know, hurt a kid in any kind of way, whether it's from the virus or whatever. What about you know, serving lunch? We'll probably have to do that in classrooms, and then you have to worry. So I think administrators are thinking we're going to have to hire additional assistants so that the teachers can have their duty-free lunch. But then where, instead of in a cafeteria where there's, you know, 2 or 3 monitors, you know, you'll have to have one in every classroom. How do you deal with, you know, going to the things like going to the restrooms and, you know, I've got to go. Well, no, there's, you know, got to wait a little bit. There's some, you know, somebody else in line that we can only put so many in the restrooms at one time. You know, what do you do about changing classes at high schools? I mean, the list goes on, and I won't try to, you know, talk about all of the things, but in all of that, how can we do it in a way with integrity? How can we, you know, take care of our most vulnerable populations? those that come with high needs, no matter what those needs are, not just special education students, but the students that struggle sometimes. So how can we be fair with them? Can we provide equity in this new situation? So I think all of those questions are on the minds of all of our teachers and administrators. And so we're, trying to figure that out.
Absolutely.
So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. And I think that you've given us a nice segue. So I'll throw it next to Dean Dinkins. Dr. Mooney, and one of the things that you mentioned in addition to the safety protocols is, safety, of course, is number one. But when we talk about meaningful instruction, let's say hypothetically that you're correct, Dr. Mooneyhan, we return to school in sort of a hybrid fashion with both virtual learning and in-person learning. Dean Dinkins, how do we ensure that this COVID-19 slide doesn't have a snowball effect over the course of a student's academic career? And what are some innovative ways that schools can use to both chart where students are now and work to combat that slide?
Well, I think as Dr. Mooneyhan was talking about, right now we have more questions than answers, but we also have some tenets that still hold true in education, and teachers know these tenets. Our academic learning and our social and emotional learning have to be knitted together, because the slide can be mediated through, strong academic content and good teaching, but it also has to come with the social emotional support, because the backpack of experiences that kids are going to be walking into classrooms, whether those are virtual or in person, are going to be really complicated. And kids are going to need an opportunity to kind of have to, process that and unpack that and reconnect with each other. A sense of connectedness is going to matter, whether that's in a virtual environment or in a face-to-face environment. And I think that we'll be looking at something that's going to be high flex. That's a term we've been using a lot in the college world right now. The idea of a really highly flexible delivery of instruction, that individual students go through virtual and in-person learning and sort of safe distances and that kind of a thing. And teachers planning instruction and responding to instruction, according not just to the delivery mode that they've been given, but also the content they have. I think diagnostic assessments are going to be more important than ever when we talk about understanding, stopping that slide from snowballing, right? The first thing is that we're going to have to understand, what is the slide? And right now, that's all very hypothetical. We know what summer melt looks like, and we can extrapolate data from previous summer melt studies. But those previous studies don't include this kind of really global traumatic shift. So there's some things that have shaken the world up cognitively for kids in a far more radical space than we've seen in traditional kind of summer melt or summer slide studies. So we're going to have to look at that. And that means that I think it has to be put in the teacher's hands. Teachers with their classrooms and their students, whether they're in person or virtually, are going to be the ones who can assess their students, know where they are, and then begin to differentiate between, who needs what in terms of content and learning style and delivery. But really, teachers are the ones that are going to be empowered to do that strong assessment and then deliver learning plans accordingly. They're going to need the resources to do it. And hopefully districts are prepared for that, or getting prepared for that, and getting support as needed. But formative assessments and diagnostic assessments are going to be key. I also think preparing kids, because one of the things we're all talking about is that the fall is a bit unpredictable, but the predictableness of the unpredictable situation is actually a benefit. Yes. And that is that we know there may have to be a shift. If we all start in face-to-face, we might have to shift online, or we might have another break in learning, or we might have a transition to NTI. Certainly with this transition to NTI, we know the challenges that have been identified. So how do we address them? How can we plan for them? You were right to talk about teachers doing incredible work in an incredibly short time period. Now we have the opportunity to say, okay, we can be a little bit more prepared. what could those variables look like and how could we plan?
Absolutely. And I think such a critical piece of that planning is going to be engagement with parents, because they have filled a critical role right now as students have been working from home on their laptops or from paper packets via NTI or whatever form they may be using currently. And so with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Christian of the PTA to share how can parents continue to be intentional in discussing the needs of their child with their teacher, and what can teachers do to show the parents that they're listening?
It's funny you should bring that up. I've been part of a subcommittee here in Fayette County on reopening and what that's going to look like. And we talked about, there were several terms that came up in some research that they did, that they presented to us. And one thing they discussed was pivot. And when you're pivoting, you have a change in strategy, but you don't change your direction. So that talked to us about the notion of not necessarily always tapping into those funds of knowledge, which would be your parents and your families, per Dr. Mapp's dual capacity framework, right? And it changes how we communicate with the schools and how we communicate with the teachers. So how we do this, when we talk about, Dr. Dinkins, you talked about predictability. We also talked about knowns and unknowns. Our knowns are, we're going to have to go back to school. Our unknown is, what is that going to look like? How are our kids going to be impacted? And how will we make the best of that situation? And how do we mitigate that slide that we know is already existing aside from the normal summer slide? So as a parent or as an advocate for families, what we've determined is the line of communication has to be both ways. But also we understand, again, per Dr. Mapp, the onus is on the schools and on the teachers. So we need teachers to tap into what we have. Nobody knows our kids better than us, right? So if there's a concern, my child has a 504. She has a 504 for anxiety and for migraines. I need those teachers, and where she is, they've been phenomenal with it. They'll come to me and say, what's the deal? Is everything okay? I need them to remember that, and I need them to not necessarily let her use it as a crutch, but acknowledge that it's a concern. And aside from COVID-19 and everything else, that still is in place. So what is predictable? Maintaining, if your child has a 504, an IEP, if there's anything in place, that you maintain that integrity at all times.
Absolutely. And with that, I'll pivot to Mr. McKim, who represents approximately 7,000 teachers in Jefferson County. I'll give you the same question. What can teachers do to better incorporate parent voice into the classroom? It's always been important. It's going to be even more important when students go back to school.
Thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to be part of this. I believe that what has been happening thus far with NTI is the relationship between parent and teacher is more direct and more connected and stronger than it has ever been in public education in Kentucky and across the nation. I know we have teachers and principals and assistant principals in our buildings reaching out directly to parents on a daily basis, making connections, touching the same parents multiple times a week. And my hope is that even if we return to largely in-person instruction, that those relationships and connections that we have built will be maintained and used to address the needs of the kids in bridging the gaps and dealing with the social emotional aspects that kids are going to be working through and so forth. So I think in a lot of ways, we've laid a really good foundation for next year in terms of parent-teacher connectivity and communication channels. And hopefully we won't just go back to the status quo we had before. Hopefully we'll have a stronger utilization of those relationships and the connection with parents.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that critical insight. I've got one more question in this section of our conversation before I throw it to my friend and colleague, Ms. Harper Kelly of KYA, who's going to have a bit more to say on the topic of educational equity. But before we get there, here's an open question to any one of our panelists. As Dr. Brooks said, we know that many of the attendees on the call today are not teachers, they're not in education, but they care a whole lot about kids, and they care a whole lot about ensuring that kids get what they need in order to be successful. So with that, I'd like for you all to speak to those people who may not be in education but want to do something to help out the world of education. What do you all need and how can they help you? And secondly, in a two-part question here, when we start to think about the state policies in this upcoming 2021 legislative session in Frankfurt, we think about federal policies on the table currently in Washington. And in particular, pivoting back to the state, we're going to have a one-year budget coming up, which is going to be critical in what's expected to be a very, very stormy economic climate. What are some things that you all need from advocates in that regard? What do you think it's going to take from our government in order to usher in this new era of education in Kentucky in the midst of this crisis? Since I started with Brent last, I'll give him the opportunity to go first this time.
All right, well, thank you. So your first question dealt with what our community partners and parents and others can do to support the work. I think the immediate thing that is ahead of us is the summer, and many people that are on the webinar or on this virtual event probably have some engagement with summer activities with our students. And I would say that there's a framing that I think says it really well, which is Maslow before Bloom, meaning we really have to, the foundation that all the academics are built on is a foundation of sort of social, emotional well-being. And that if you try to build on the academic side without having the foundation, it's like building on sand and it sinks in. And what you build is not sound. So I think one thing that all of us could do is to, even as we talk about the COVID slide and the loss on the academic side, I think one thing we can all do is to try to remember kids are really social creatures, and they're not experiencing normal social behaviors in this isolation that they're in. For some of them, school is the most stable and reassuring part of their life because they have very traumatic things going on in their home or in their neighborhood. And so they're in that home situation nonstop. So I think we can all think about, like, if we're doing summer programming or in summer engagements with students, how can we build in maybe mindfulness or some ways to get at opportunities for the students to process their social emotional side of what they're dealing with. We're not psychologists, but there are some things that lay people can do in that regard that could be invaluable for kids and provide that outlet. So I would say one thing we can all do is try to be mindful of the social emotional aspect and not get completely focused on just the academic side. Otherwise, the academic work we do, I think, will not be built on the foundation we need.
Yeah, I think you make a critical point there. And hot off the presses, just yesterday, I believe, the Kentucky Department of Education released a document highlighting what they intend to do to make social and emotional learning more of a priority.
Yep.
So rest assured that us at KYA, from our education, child welfare, and health lens, as well as many other lenses, will be evaluating that to ensure that we have that strong foundation when kids go back to school. So thank you for that point. Dr. Mooneyhan, I know that you are great when it comes to finances, great when it comes to leadership, and several other elements when it really comes into making a school work and organizational level or district work. What are we going to need in this budget, this state budget, to ensure that we get the schools that our kids deserve?
Well, what I'm concerned most about is that there could be regression in funding with what's happening in the economy. The tax revenues are going to be down. And so we've got expanded needs. And quite frankly, if the General Assembly and the governor don't be pretty creative about finding ways to secure at least stable funding and hopefully some increases, it's going to be very difficult on districts to try or to do new things that and ways to reach kids, and possibly needing additional resources to do that when you have a decline in funding. I hope that doesn't happen, but certainly education is usually treated, in governor's budget and in congressional budgets as a priority. But when you have a huge reduction in revenue, I'm really worried about that. And I'm also worried about the fact that when that occurs, the whole equity question, some districts that are better funded or have reasonably high property assessments or other ways of getting revenue won't be impacted like those students in those school districts that have a lot of students in poverty, or a lot of they don't have property valuations, so they're going to lose perhaps both state funding, but then the local funding, either property tax or occupational tax.
And I think that provides a good segue for my colleague Harper to get us a little bit more ingrained in the discussion of educational equity. So I'm going to turn it over to Harper for a minute, who will lead that portion of today's discussion.
Hi guys, thank you, Ben. So kind of in this transitioning over to the equity piece, it makes us think about something that Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman reminded us of in our forum last week, where she reminded us that children are, we know that we're all facing these problems, and children in schools, many of the problems that children are facing now were problems prior to this pandemic hitting. But these issues seem more visible and more heightened during these trying times. We know, for example, and this is something that we all kind of watched on social media and have really been, many of have been focused on helping provide the nutritional challenges when the schools were closed and everyone was sent home, and how are we going to get the nutritional support to those families where they were used to having that, at least for breakfast and lunch, and a lot of them relied on schools for their weekend meals as well, through the backpack programs that they would provide. Or so we know that schools have always played a vital role in providing the nutritional supports. And so now we've got this new heightened challenge to strategize how to continue to provide this support through the summer and through this upcoming unique school year, just like Dr. Mooneyhan even mentioned. How do you serve lunch if people are in school in a safe way? So it's issues like these that push us to look at those solutions and strategies that address this equity piece, and we're more aware of how each student, not the group of students, but how each student will be coming to us in a completely different place, regardless of where they are or where they were when they left. And so, when Brent, you mentioned the Maslow before Bloom, the meeting those basic needs, their social, emotional, as well as their academic. So we want to hear a little bit more from you guys about the new and unique challenges facing our urban rural students, students with special needs, children living in poverty, and our English language learners. What strategies are there to prevent that widening of an opportunity gap that they already have? So Dr. Dinkins, I think we could start with you.
So I would say the very first strategy, and it sort of segues with the question that Ben asked earlier, is that we need digital access for every kid in the state.
Yeah.
Whether you're talking about an urban or a rural context, we all had kids in school districts who couldn't get reliable internet access, right? And that's one of the things, in addition to schools needing to feed kids, which is 100% truth, you know, everybody started to shift to this sort of like online platform for learning, which meant that kids needed to be able to get to be able to access that. And that might have been a reliable Wi-Fi connection. That might have been the need for a device to effectively get them on. And that digital divide was just really highlighted throughout this process. I think that that's a bottom tier equity issue. I think when we talk about strategies as related to NTI, technology becomes an essential part of it. I don't think technology is all of it. I don't think technology automatically solves it, but I think it becomes a very clear pathway to provide kids and parents with support, whether we're talking about enrichments or we're talking about direct lessons. So that would be my first level of need that we really need to think about as a state. How do we do that? You know, we know we had high school students driving to their school parking lots to be able to do their lessons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're an elementary school kid, that's not necessarily an option for you. You know, if you're a middle school kid, that becomes a lot more challenging. You know, I think we also have to think about learning spaces. That's the other thing that we heard that kids, if they had access to technology to be able to engage, they might not have had good learning spaces in their homes. Mm-hmm. You know, think about all of our youth that qualify under McKinney-Vento that are living in substandard housing. They're living in overcrowded housing. We saw that at the college level when kids went home. You know, reaching out to professors saying, look, I need an extension because I'm now in charge of my younger siblings because I'm home, or I now have these other responsibilities. So I think that, you know, that's something we have to think about. Is there a way to provide appropriate technology access to every kid? And is there a way to somehow open up learning spaces for kids who need them? And I don't know that I have a clear set of strategies for that, but I think that's very important. That's very important.
Thank you. Dr. Mooneyhan, I would love to hear from, we would love to hear from you. You know, the kind of that urban-rural divide seems pretty wide, especially in Kentucky, obviously, especially if you think about our Eastern Kentucky, Western Kentucky, those are that are in the far reaches, where we've actually heard some unique strategies like utilizing Wi-Fi on school buses and putting the school bus kind of in an area of a city where folks that live around there might have more access to that technology. But do you see similar challenges for urban and versus that rural setting? Because most of your districts are that rural arena.
Yeah, I would say I think it's a challenge for all of our districts in terms of it's not. I don't know that it's that much greater in rural. It can be, but it's not always. But on the technology piece, you know, and probably some of the others don't. We operate an iLead Academy for 5 of our rural school districts. And one of the things we've done, I think, pretty successfully is the utilization of mobile hotspots. And so that sort of levels the playing field. And many of our students at iLead are the lower socioeconomic. And now and of course, you've got incumbent issues with mobile hotspots, and you have to know how to police that and have all the rules in place. But I've talked about this also on some of the statewide webinars that we've had. But I think all districts are going to be looking at way to level the playing field regarding technology. I mean, if you do NTI, you've got to have, connectivity. And so we've got to find the way, and maybe that's the kind of thing we ask our General Assembly to look at. What can they do statewide? What kind of efficiencies to get the services delivered statewide? So
that's a great suggestion. And Penny, I really want to make sure that we hear from the voice of the parents, especially understanding that you have a daughter that you said has a 504 plan, and so especially those families with and special populations. Honestly, what tools can parents use? Do you suggest to advocate for particular needs of their own child and their own student?
First thing, and I want to address this, Dr. Dinkins brought it up, this notion of everyone having access to technology. Fayette County, we've had an influx of mobile hotspots, and it's great, and they're doing their best to provide. But I think what's important, in case everyone doesn't realize it, Pritchard Committee and several other organizations have started a campaign. So where you contact our legislators and say, we need to make broadband part of the infrastructure. It needs to be available to every single person. So in terms of advocacy, contact your legislators and make it known and make it vocal that this is equity at the federal and state level, an inequity, right? So as an overarching thing, we need to acknowledge the inequities that exist. This has really just taken all of the lights and put it all on the inequities that we've chosen to maybe just ignore, or it's not as bad as everyone says it is, right? The gap is a manifestation of other issues. It's not really a gap. All of these things that we know to be true, other people are acknowledging that they're true. So as a parent, it's difficult for me, as much as an advocate as I am for mine, it's difficult for me to speak in just the terms of mine. Because I tell everybody I have 44,000 babies in this district, and I go to the mat for every single one of them. And my bigger concern is that we don't hold those at the legislative level accountable for doing right by our babies. And, Dr. Mooneyhan is right. When we talk about the funding and the budget, I'm still concerned about Senate Bill 158 passing, because now we've changed the definition, and this is about accountability and assessment. When Dr. Dinkins talked about what assessment is going to look like, we as a state PTA and we as local parents tried our best to advocate and get them to understand that changing the definition of what a gap is and changing how these groups are going to be measured is nothing short of, how can I put this delicately, screwing a bunch of groups of kids. This is about equity at its base. So in terms of the definition of the gap, we now compare the kids within the group as opposed to as a whole. We know what that's going to look like, and we know what that's going to do for kids with special needs, for kids with 504s, for whatever the concern, even the excellence gap. My kid's in the excellence gap, and I'm concerned about her slide in a different way when summer comes, right? So what can parents do? The plug is, the easy answer is join your PTA. It's not about bake sales. It's about advocating for your child. I am part of the largest American advocacy organization, the largest in this country since April of 1897. And our goal is to make every child's potential a reality by advocating and empowering families to engage and advocate for all children. So that said, we have to hold people accountable, and we have to get them to acknowledge that, yes, these inequities are real.
And so talking about assessment, I think that provides us a good leeway into the final topic of conversation today. And that's regarding state standardized testing, in particular the K-Prep here in Kentucky. We know that early in the crisis this past year, the U.S. Secretary of Education, in conjunction with several state commissioners of education around the country, they moved, and we think rightfully so, to suspend state standardized testing for this year for very obvious reasons. And so a question that we receive pretty frequently here at KYA is, what about the 2021 year? What are the views of our panelists around that potential suspension of state testing as we move into a new academic year? And I'll start first with Brent McKim. Be interested to get your perspective on that. And Brent, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
There we go.
It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without at least one of those.
Right.
Well, the short version is, I hope that we will not have a state assessment in the spring. I think that would allow us to focus on the social emotional aspects without obsessing on trying to not only cover all of the year's content, but the year and a half of content. And I think it's incumbent on the adults to think about the students. It's not necessarily always the best approach to demand that the students adjust everything to meet our expectations. We have to meet them halfway and think about what is a reasonable expectation on our part for students. And it's probably not reasonable to expect every student to be where they would have been in a normal context next spring. And so if we have the anticipation though of the state assessment looming over us, I think the large bureaucracies, which are school districts, respond to the stimulus that they have, which is that accountability, pressure. And I think that will lead to counterproductive outcomes. So I would hope that we could try to think about bridging strategies to allow us to focus on the right things as we come back, and then think about what that looks like and what reasonable expectations would be going forward that don't overemphasize playing catch up on the most low-level skills. And additionally, if we are coming back and there's a second wave and we have to go back into an NTI-set sort of approach, I would hope that we could be thinking about doing more project-based, whole child interdisciplinary approaches where the student has a lot of agency in their learning, because those sorts of things transition well into and out of that kind of distance learning environment.
And Dean Dinkins, as we begin to imagine what accountability could look like, what should accountability look like in order to serve the needs of the individual student? And how could we potentially reimagine that moving forward? Let's say hypothetically, if testing were to be suspended in 21 as it was in 20. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll go back to the growth model that I mentioned earlier this year, or earlier this Zoom meeting. Sorry, it doesn't feel like a year. It's going by very fast. Earlier this Zoom meeting, I think at the beginning of the year, the big question that teachers are going to have to face is, where are their kids now?
Yeah.
And teachers and schools, individual teachers are the ones who are sort of best equipped to handle that question, right? There are lots of different diagnostic assessments that can be used that put the power in teachers' hands to figure out where their students are in terms of learning and content areas, and then make a plan for how to get them to where they want them to be. And I think that sort of growth model is going to be something that offers a really strong opportunity for assessment and for documentation here. I think that the use of a K-Prep assessment in 21 doesn't make sense unless we really understand that that assessment would be used for something radically different than it had ever been used for before.
Right.
We can't compare year to year, right? It's not, you're not going to be able to map that on your growth chart following the trajectory you want to go, because the context in which we have done that in the past does not hold for this upcoming year, right? So it doesn't work. I mean, we're seeing colleges across the nation say, you know what, I'm not sure the ACT and SAT are going to be required for admission for us.
Yep.
They're recognizing that that standardized test isn't going to hold water in this context because the context is so different. And I think K-12 schools have to do the same.
Agreed.
In terms of how can they assess, you know, I'm going to again say it should be within the school to see what the student growth is from the beginning of the year to the end of the year.
Mhm.
And a traditional K-Prep assessment just doesn't do that. It's not designed to do that.
Right.
If there is a positive opportunity, it is an opportunity for us to really step back and reimagine what accountability should be within a school system, right? If the bottom line of a school right now is being able to keep students fed, that's not part of an accountability matrix when you talk about a school that gets put on AIS status, right? But that's what bottom line they are expected to do right now, get your students fed. If we go back to Maslow before Bloom, as Brent said, then let's judge schools and teachers by how they're sort of meeting these fundamental needs in addition to academic ones. And recognizing that differentiation on steroids is going to be what next year will take. And therefore, a one-size assessment doesn't give us good access there. Now, I do think a one-size assessment can be good to step back and say, all right, what's a big picture and let me make decisions, but not for the sake of sort of high-stakes accountability, which is how we've traditionally used it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dinkins, I would certainly agree with you on that particular point. You know, assessment, if we're using assessment for what assessment is intended to be used for, we're using it to help the student, the parent, the teacher, and the community see where a student is in order to get them where they need to be. You know, it shouldn't be a punitive measure. It should be a measure designed around the needs of that individual student and that individual desk to help that individual succeed. I think if we could ever divorce assessment from the, you know, the external punitive political, then we can really harness that power. But I've got to move on because we've only got 5 minutes left. So, but I appreciate it. I appreciate your comments very much. I think that you hit a chord with that, certainly. But moving on, and I'm going to hold you to it, so I'll have to, you know, use my teacher voice and cut you off if you go longer than this. So I'm just giving you the warning now. 30 seconds or less to every member of our panel. 30 seconds or less. The biggest challenge, potential biggest solution. Dr. Mooneyhan looks really perplexed and ready to go, so I'm going to throw it to him.
Oh, gosh. Biggest challenge is just getting schools open next year in a way that is, you know, effective. I think that's what's on the minds of superintendents and teachers and others. So just figuring it out in this kind of changing environment is the challenge. And, you know, we get new information all the time that impacts what, you know, the way we want to do things. But I think that's the biggest challenge.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Ms. Christian, biggest challenge, biggest solution or opportunity?
Biggest challenge is going to be to mitigate long-term equity issues. The gap is going to get huge. And what can we do? We know that there's always a slide, and we're going to keep using that term. But what do we do? Because when we talk about assessment and accountability, 2 years down the road, we're still going to see the impact of what this has done in terms of the classroom for some of these groups. So how do we mitigate that? And I think one way we can really, really work on that is to hold those at the state and federal level accountable to make sure that the schools and the kids get what they need to minimize it as much as possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your insight today. I'm going to go next with Mr. Brent McKim for biggest challenge opportunity.
I think the biggest challenge continues to be the inequity in the supports and opportunities our students have, inequities in terms of access to technology, in terms of access to out-of-school support, in terms of access to a rich and engaging curriculum with after-school opportunities, and so on. And I think the opportunity is those disparities are now more clear and glaring, I think, than they have ever been. And it is an opportunity to be honest with ourselves as a society and say, we can't accept this and we've got to make changes to address that. And I do think that is a real moment of opportunity that we're in right now amid all of this difficulty.
Very good. And Dr. Dinkins, your biggest challenge or solution or opportunity?
So I'm going to agree with what has been said previously, that the biggest challenge is a challenge of equity and access. And I think that we need to recognize that through this challenge, that what we've highlighted is that schools are being used for things that are much bigger than academics. And that we need to step back as not just a state, but as a nation, and recognize that, okay, that's their primary function maybe. And so we need to look at them differently. Our biggest opportunity is that we cannot suffer from a failure of the imagination. We have incredible potential in this state. We have incredible potential in terms of thinkers and doers and advocates, and we need to think about leveraging that. And we can't be boxed in by traditional systems that we've used in the past just because they're traditional.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Man, you put it best. What a way to end. Very uplifting, inspirational, which is, what good teachers do. We all seek to inspire. We all seek to change the world, or we wouldn't have got in this business to begin with, quite frankly. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our group of panelists. You've been truly wonderful today. Before we go, I also want to take the opportunity to thank each of our panelists for dedicating their careers and really a sizable portion of their lives to the profession of public education. None of you all get enough credit. And I get so tired of people saying that, because I look forward to the day when every one of you will get the credit that you are due as teachers, classroom administrators, and people that are there for our youngest kids and our most vulnerable. So thank you. In saying that now, I want to throw it to Harper and to Jesse, who will close us out here in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, so thank you, Ben, and panelists, and again, cannot thank all of you for joining us. Just want to give you all some closing remarks as far as next steps. So some of the questions you shared through your RSVPs and in the chat box, which were some great. I was having a hard time going back and forth between the chat box and listening to the panelists, because it was a great discussion going on the side as well. And some of those questions may have been answered in this conversation. We are recording all of these answers. We're keeping them. We will be utilizing them for our upcoming podcasts and forums as well. We also will be sharing some of these ideas with decision makers, and we encourage you to do the same to your local and state and national decision makers as we talk through all of these things that we need to advocate for together. And as I believe Dr. Dinkins mentioned at one point, there are more questions than we have answers in regard to what's next. I know that we hope that the decisions made in these upcoming weeks and months are best for every single one of our kids, and taking into account, again, those variable situations and families that every kid across our Commonwealth do come to school with. We do have these advocate virtual forums every Wednesday, don't forget, at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time. We will be sending out a follow-up email after this, either later this afternoon or tomorrow, that will include a recording of this forum along with an RSVP for next week's forum. And again, we just want to thank you all for what you do on behalf of Kentucky's kids. Thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jesse.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hope to see you next week.
Thanks.